Hi. Hi, I'm Jen. I'm an aspiring writer that's currently working on their first novel, and I thought it'd be fun to just sit down and do a two-part series on tips on how to receive and give helpful writing feedback. So, for context, I joined a writing group last year. It's been amazing. And as a part of that writing group, we give regular critique on each other's work. It's definitely a learned skill. And I will say that I try to get better at it every single time. But for the sake of this exercise, I want to avoid using the terms like good and bad feedback and more focus it in the lens of more helpful and more productive feedback instead. So that's it. I think that's it. Let's hop into part one, which is tips on how to receive more helpful, productive writing feedback. So, for tip number one, make sure that you are emotionally ready for taking writing critique. Sharing your work is a very vulnerable experience, and even if you think you're as tough as nails, you might surprise yourself with how you react to some of the feedback that you might get. So, to help with that, I highly encourage you to make sure that you have a level of trust with the people you share your work with. That way, you can feel a little bit more confident that the critique that you receive is coming from a good place and maybe perhaps will feel a little bit less personal. So, tip number two, make sure that your sample is readable and ready for review. It's totally okay if it's rough or not super polished yet. That's the expectation of a draft. But I think that as a critiquer, it might be hard to give helpful feedback when a piece is so rough. And so I really encourage doing a once over. Just read through your sample before you send it out. Like if it's chock full of grammatical mistakes, if there's tons of spelling errors, if it's like super unpolished, it might be hard for a critiquer to give helpful feedback. So I highly encourage the practice of just doing a once over, make sure it's readable before sending a sample out for review. I'd say if you're in more of the shaping phase and you need feedback there, it might be more helpful to actually hop on a call or a chat to ask for feedback versus sending out a very unpolished, less readable piece for feedback. Alright, so tip three, I recommend sharing your sample out in a format that's easy to annotate. I personally use Google Docs and I set it to comments only. This allows for critiquers to leave like live feedback as they're running through your piece. It also is more helpful to you in the future if you're trying to just refer back to like a little spelling mistake that someone pointed out or want to see where people had particularly positive or negative reactions. If you send it in a format that is difficult to annotate, you might not get the most helpful feedback because people will have to either take notes on the side or try to identify specific areas where they had any feedback to give you. And you might start to get some more general feedback versus more helpful, productive feedback. So I highly encourage sharing your piece out in a format that's very easy to annotate. Tip number four, set the table up front. So what do I mean by that? It means to prime your critiquers with any helpful context or guidance up front. So that might include a summary of everything that has happened or some parts of what has happened leading up to this sample. It might include links to previous samples you've offered up for critique, so on and so forth. I like to keep mine at the top of my Google Doc so that it's all there in one place. And it also includes some guidance on the very specific areas you're looking for critique on. And that leads up to my tip five. Be very clear about the critique that you're looking for in this sample. So as you get a better sense of your story, laying out very generic questions or generic areas for feedback might not be as helpful as being more specific. So as some examples, you could just share your sample and be like, let me know what you think, versus saying, what do you think about the pacing? Or even better, is the pacing too fast-paced? Or even better and more specific, does this particular section drag? I found that when you ask generic questions, you generally get generic answers to things. So being very specific upfront about the feedback that you're looking for can get you more helpful, specific feedback. I think there's some psychology behind this too. I found that most of the time, people don't want to hurt your feelings. And by laying down very specific parameters, people might feel a little bit more comfortable giving you that feedback because you're asking for it. So some examples of things that I've asked in the past that are super specific and helpful was something like, does this character come off as their age? I was really concerned that Rosé comes off as a little young. She is an adult, she's 31, and I wanted to make sure that I establish her age and set that tone very quickly in my sample. And I did get some people who were surprised because they kind of went into it thinking it's a romantasy, it's YA. So by learning her age, it kind of set the tone right away and fixed the framework around how the piece was going to be perceived. Some other questions I've asked in the past are, is the relationship clear between these two characters? And does this interaction come off as overly emotional? It may also be helpful to make it clear that you're open to more overarching feedback by asking things like, are there things that you want to see more or less of? And lastly, if you're looking to get regular, helpful, thoughtful writing feedback, make sure that you're reciprocating by doing that yourself as well. It is a big investment of time and consideration to give writing critique, and if you are not giving that feedback to other people, it might be difficult for them to be invested in your piece and giving that level of effort and care into the feedback. So make sure that you're reciprocating if you want to get helpful feedback yourself. So that's it. To recap, here are some tips on how to receive productive, helpful writing feedback. 1, make sure that you are emotionally ready to take writing critique, which includes making sure that you have people you trust to share your piece with. Number 2, it's making sure that your piece is ready for review and readable. 3, share it in a format that is easy to annotate. 4, make sure that you're setting up the table up front. And 5, be specific with the critique parameters that you're asking for. And 6, reciprocate by giving helpful and productive writing feedback yourself. So that's it for this video. There will be a part 2 on tips on how to give helpful, productive writing feedback as well. But for now, these are my lessons for the day. Bye.